Wel, tro gyntaf, hoffwn i dweud diolch i Wyn, Bill a Walter am i bod yma, felly, unwaith eto. Nawr dwi'n symud i Saesneg. Thank you very much for being here. I'll have to read most of it because my improvisation skills in English are not as developed as in Spanish, but anyway. The arrival of Welsh settlers in the shores of Puerto Madryn in 1865 represented the beginning of the first successful and continued European settlement in Chubut's history, a land in which the Argentine state had no active presence until the so-called conquest of the desert from the late 1870s. Because of these, the settlement and its ethnic group have historically occupied a privileged role in the historical chronicle and identity of Chubut because of its foundation and character. Since 1955, Chubut ceased to be a national territory controlled directly by the national government and became an autonomous province with a local government elected by its own people. This new government considered necessary to construct and narrate its own history and its own past in order to define a provincial identity of its own. Before this period, no work had addressed the territory history in a comprehensive way, like in the way of just the history of Chubut as an entity. In this way, school and education system are among the most important practices used by nations to produce and reproduce identities and discourses of belonging, constructing a narration of its history and defining its main actors and actions, and explaining how the province was shaped by these historical processes. In this way, historical educational literature represents a central tool in shaping Chubut's past, its culture, and its heritage. And so does historical literature, as it is aimed for a different public and supported by the prestige of the writers and the endorsement of government provides to their work. So today we propose to analyze how school textbooks and this particular kind of historiographical production approaches and narrates the history of the Welsh settlement, its culture and its heritage, in order to understand which role of history is given to this particular episode of the Welsh settlement Chubut to Chubut's cultural identity. We will focus regarding educational literature in the period from 1980 to 2015, where the main school textbooks produced by the province were developed and used. And for the historical literature, we will take the period 1960 to 1990, and three particular books in particular in this case. Regarding school textbooks, they represent one of the pillars of modern education. They're used by both students and teachers in a classroom. Two Argentinian researchers, Fernandez and Rodriguez, consider that textbooks are the curriculum materials with the highest incidence in classroom learning and have a management and configurator role of teaching practice that makes it qualitatively different from other resources. Even outside the classroom, in general, most of the time students spend in their studies and work revolves around textbook. Ruth Miller Elson even further considered that school textbooks she considers them as a reflection of the political and cultural objectives that prevail in a society. She even considers that these textbooks are the ultimate mirror of power. So, regarding the regional studies in Chubut, they comprise a very reduced space within the education system. And given the Buenos Aires-oriented textbooks used usually in national schools, the regional studies are to be developed just by the provinces. This changed in 1978 when the provincial governments were in charge of maintaining the educational system for each of their provinces, therefore not being a national system anymore, and allowing the provinces to produce their own textbooks and manage their contents. This topic, the studies about their own provinces, is taught in the fourth year of primary or elementary education, and the subjects are approved and even produced by the Provincial Ministry of Education. And they cover certain topics such as geography, climate, historical and human aspects of it, and natural as well. From this period, from 1980 to 2006, 5 books were produced, which we will which we will work on from now on. The first of all, well, this is a map of Chubut. Most of you know it already. These are some dates that are worth taking into consideration. The first one, of course, is 1955, in which Chubut achieves its status of province, and 1958, in which the first democratically elected provincial government is chosen, and the creation of the Directorate or Secretariat of Culture and Education, in which two ideas are planned. The first one is to establish an official history of the province, and the second one is to take the Welsh settlement as the central element in Chubut's history, such as Geraldine showed us in the previous work. The third one, as the one I spoke before, was 1978, when provinces took charge of primary and secondary education, and the last one is 2006, in which the latest textbook, which is the one used up to date, was issued and published. The first book we'll talk about today is Chubut mi provincia, or Chubut my province, which was published in the 1980s. There is no specific date that I could find, unfortunately, but it was the one who was published after the first educational law and after the Chubut's government designed a specific curriculum for Chubut's history and other aspects of this territory. This book was well used into the 1990s. I studied primary school from 1991 to 96, and I used it even though there were some other books available already. And its author is Marcelino Castillo Castro, who is from the neighboring province of Rio Negro. But he was specializing in producing school textbooks for the province, so he was in charge of doing this particular job. In this book, the historical section begins with the native Patagonians, but regarding the Welsh settlement, it is surprising that the entire experience is narrated in only one page. And under the subtitle From Wales to Chubut, the first paragraph explains the arrival of the settlers as well as their reasons, mentioning some key figures such as Lewis Jones, Edwin Roberts, and Abraham Matthews, and describing the settlement itself, the relationship with the indigenous peoples, explained as generally good and profitable for both parties. The publishing of the first newspaper is mentioned at West as well, and the creation of the first school. And the section ends by explaining how the settlers managed to expand up to the foundation of the town of Gymreig. The remaining historical events of Chubut are explained in a similar and synthetic form, continuing with the creation of the governorship of Patagonia in 1878 and the conquest of the desert, which, along with, I quote, along with the following campaigns, consolidated peace with the Indians definitely. The establishment of Chubut as a national territory and the expedition of Governor Fontana and the riflemen of Chubut is briefly covered under the title Into the West, as well as the establishment of the Cynhadledd settlement. However, there is a second book called Noticia, in where attention is given to the Welsh culture and its heritage in Chubut. This book was published simultaneously. These are some pictures of the Chubut mi provincia. You can see the typical mimosa, which is always in every book, and the native Patagonians. And the second book, the Noticia, is the one who pays real attention to culture and heritage, Welsh culture and heritage in Chubut. It was published simultaneously along with Chubut my provincia, and it's a compilation of short stories and poems that complements it. In the first section dedicated to the Welsh settlement, some historical facts which did not appear in the previous book are presented here. Titled The Welsh Settlers Arrive, it briefly explains the causes and events leading to the arrival to Chubut. Along with other sections, named the relationship with Indians, difficulties and sacrifices, and the settlement consolidates and expands, this textbook manages to expand the small amount of information Chubut mi provincia provides. The most interesting section, of course, is the second one, which is an article on the Ysgol, which you can see here, in which it narrates the history and highlights its continuity today. It is found between texts regarding Chubut's heritage, both natural and cultural. You can see Wales and, well, Wales as well, on one page. And the third section is a poem called Settlers, in which which is written in reference to the Welsh, and it describes, it uses typical characteristics attributed to the Welsh feat, which is a word like it's very used when describing the Welsh experience, in a way. I call it experience. Avoid that kind of laudatory words. And they talk about the search for the new homeland, their sacrifice and work, the endured hardships, and the representation of Patagonia as a barren and cursed land, much as Fernando told us and Darwin told us before him. And finally, the fruits given by transformation of the desert. So, in short, the purpose of these texts was to provide basic information to establish a basic knowledge for elementary school students about the province's history. In 1991, a new book was presented, whose name is Chubut. Chubut means is the Tewelti word for the river, Camwy. And it was written by two primary school teachers from Comodoro Rivadavia and launched in 1991 by a provincial publishing house. Its design was much more modern than the former one, and it was intended to provide information in a much more systematic way, both through text and image. I didn't put any other image from this book in this presentation, but the part regarding the indigenous people has a fantastic what's the name? Quadro? Synoptico? How would you say that? Table. Yeah, like a table comparing Tehuelches and Mapuche and the different behaviors, religion, and that kind of things. But regarding the Welsh settlement, it is covered from a chapter named The Welsh Project, and we found a greater amount of information comparing it to the previous book. However, it is notable the absence of certain important figures in the establishment of the settlement, such as Michael D. Jones, Abraham Matthews, or Edwin Roberts, especially notable given the references made to, for example, Lord Jones Parry, and even more interestingly, to Henry Leavenworth Jones. Successive sections rapidly describe the progress of the settlement, which is synthesized through these titles: birth of the first town, the settlement secured, relationship with Indians, and organization of the settlement. It is interesting to see as well that much of the information that appears in this book is repeated from the Chubut Mi Provincia one. It is basically the same information copied from the latter one. Throughout this reading, the role and presence of the Argentine government in its establishment of the settlements is emphasized, which it wasn't in the previous one, by narrating the first raising of the Argentine flag by Colonel Murga, and the foundation of Tre Rawson, and then a name named after Guillermo Rawson, who was the government official in charge of arranging the settlement of the Welsh. The last paragraphs dedicated to the Welsh experience that focus on specific events, in which is currently one of the most memorable episodes of the Welsh experience in Chubut, which is the episode of the Malaclara. Actually, there's one of the few pictures that depicts the Welsh history in this book is the tomb of the Malaclara, which after seeing, when I studied and I saw this, and then I went to Trevelyan and saw the actual stone, was quite a thing, like, you know, like watching the Eiffel Tower for the first time or something like that. It was a feat in itself. And the last time the Welsh are mentioned in this book is in the section dedicated to the human dimension or demographics about the province. And regarding the ethnic composition of the population of Chubut, the book affirms that the Welsh settlers were its first white humans inhabitants. In the late 1990s, the national education system suffered a period of restructuring that had begun in the previous decade, and a new education law was sanctioned. This law amended a law in force since the late 19th century. So the changes were quite radical in certain contents, like history, geography, civics, and demography, as well as the restructuring of the education cycles. Some updates to the curriculum of social sciences at a national level were primarily focused on Latin American integration, the Malvinas, Falklands, conflict and cause, the military dictatorship, and the democracy and rule of law, and the rights of indigenous people, which is what matters in this particular case, as well as technological advances managed to to advance in design and printing new and more sophisticated books, textbooks in this case. Within this context, Sentir Chubut was published in 1998. This book is particularly important because the way it explains the history, it is not just Chubut oriented, but rather oriented towards the entire history of Patagonia. I suspect the historical part of this book was meant for different textbooks from different provinces of Patagonia, and not just for the case of Chubut itself. Therefore, this is the book that addresses the Welsh settlement with this smaller amount of space, with just one page out of almost 200 of them. The most important one, however, is the latest one, called Chubut Pura Naturaleza, Chubut Pure Nature, which was published in 2006, and it was conceived as part of a new education law which replaced the previous curricular system and deepened the introduction of topics such as the right of indigenous people. Unlike the previous texts, this book appears to have been written by a team of experts, like historians, professors of geography, etc., and is entirely sponsored by the provincial government and printed by it. And it is also given for free in every school in the province. The historical section itself presents some notable differences with previous publications, as its title, Time and Space, Building Collective Memory and Identity, already suggests the purpose of teaching and learning history of school. It also suggests that every element addressed in the unit is part of Chubut's identity, an important discursive shift from previous texts. One of the main improvements within this book is to update the interpretation of indigenous people's history, as these are not understood as extinct, but as a culture that still exists, with legitimate claims and with the right to be recognized as such, which is quite a different viewpoint from previous books. And when it comes to the subject of the Welsh settlement, it is surprising to see that it occupies a bigger and more privileged space than any of the previous textbooks. Out of the 72 pages devoted to the historical aspect of the province, 18 are used for this particular history. And it consists of two parts. The first, which is dedicated to the history of the settlement itself from its inception to the early 20th century, which I show some examples of the pages. And the second one, which is dedicated basically to show the Welsh customs, traditions, and its heritage today. It also uses the story of the whole of John Daniel Evans and his horse Malacara as well. The layout of the book is much more attractive and much modern, as you can see, but also uses different type of resources. For example, small quotations of books like the Chronicle of the Welsh Settlement by Abraham Matthews or Dringo Randes by Elina Morgan, which weren't present in the previous books. It also confers a generous amount of space to work about the relationship within the native Patagonians and the Welsh. And some of the subjects which were covered like really in a very short way in the previous books are addressed in a more developed way here. For example, regarding press, it moves beyond the publication of a Brit, and it actually covers the creation of a Drafod, which was the most interesting newspaper of the settlement, as Walter has shown us already. And the Welsh are also mentioned in the establishing of the Andes settlement and in the 1902 plebiscite, which wasn't mentioned until that moment, which favored Argentina and the border demarcation with Chile, explaining in this sense the nature of the holiday commemorating such event for the last 13 years, which wasn't commemorated before 2002. The second section, which is the one which interests us the most, begins with the title, To Learn More About Our Past and Present Culture, and presents the Welsh traditions and cultural heritage. The Eisteddfod is highlighted as a central element, along with the role of literature, chapel and school in the daily life of the Welsh people, as well as the now traditional Welsh tea, which you can see down there. It also uses the story of the Malacara, and by using fragments of Clary Evans' book, John Daniel Evans' The Miller. And this section ends by discussing the conversion of certain historic buildings, such as the mill in Trevelyan and the railway stations in Gaiman, Puerto Madryn, and Trelew, to museums, where the text says Welsh and Mapuche heritage are preserved. This textbook in particular reflects the look of a government whose political policy consisted in putting into value two central identities in Chubut, the indigenous people and the Welsh traditions. The latter is effectively thought as a central factor in the construction of both the province and the Chubut provincial identity. Welsh heritage is therefore presented as a major cultural element of the province, but also as a central touristic attraction, both for the people from and outside of Chubut. This is also a reflection of the province's political and cultural agenda, in which heritage, both natural and cultural, hence the name of the book, Pure Nature for a Province, is built from a tourist-oriented approach. Now, regarding the second topic of today's lecture, it's historical literature. Regarding historical literature comprising the whole history of Chubut, there are not many books regarding that. Very few books managed to, or proposed, building such a comprehensive view on the history of the province. However, we could find 3 books which were published since 1962, especially since this moment in which this young province of Chubut from 1958 needed to present a history and an identity of its own. So in 1962, a book that intended to meet this expectation was published, named Chubut, Dream and Reality. It was written by Maria Pia Strasser, a young primary school teacher from Comodoro Rivadavia, which is my city, as Fernando told us. And as you can see here, this is the front page of the book, and it clearly shows no ties with the Welsh settlement, because all it shows is the economy from the south of the province. We have the oil wells from Comodoro and the sheep from the south plains of Chubut. And this book was prefaced by Armando Brown Menendez, which was one of the leading historians of Patagonia in that period. He was from Chile, and was quickly approved by the Secretary of Culture for publication and distribution in schools across the province as a key reading in the studies of Chubut. The title truly represents the corpus of the text, Chubut, Dream and Reality, as it offers a historical account of the provincial history read in not only a positivistic key, in which the dichotomy civilization-barbarism is found throughout the text, but also including anecdotes, short biographies, and even poetry that can be found framed within the narrative. The process of colonization and settling of the Welsh is understood as a feat of civilization. The Welsh case is interpreted as a crucial event in the foundation of Chubut, and the settlers are highlighted as pioneers. This particular concept of pioneer is central in a much wider narrative that articulates the entire history of Patagonia. This way, the figure of the pioneer and the reading of his actions under a tone of epic is the structuring element of Strasser's work. And here I quote part of it, which you can read. We have seen the importance of the Welsh settlement in the development of Chubut's history. The arrival of this handful of intrepid immigrants in 1865 constitutes a historical date of nationwide transcendence. They start civilization's work on the territory of Chubut. A new racial core enters the gigantic melting pot where the greatness of the country is merged. It's quite a thing. The relationship between the Welsh settlers and the native Patagonians presents a very present element within the text. The chapter names The Indians and the Welsh Face to Face is dedicated to this topic. She begins by explaining that the desert that began south of Buenos Aires, I quote, was under the absolute rule of the wild tribes. Most of them, displaying a ruthless cruelty, have written pages of blood and pain in the history of the progress and development of our country. Nevertheless, the model of peaceful coexistence, which is currently accepted in Chubut's history, already appears in this text, in the same way as it is thought in a collective memory and written in the official accounts of the settlement today. In fact, this information is taken directly from the works of Lewis Jones and Abraham Matthews. And this section ends, the historical section ends with an optimistic view of the future of the settlement and acknowledging the defining role of the foundation of Chubut. However, this text was the first to present a continuous narrative of the historical development of Chubut, although describing the foundation of Comodoro Rivadavia as the culminating point of province's history, hence the cover of the book. In 1975, the second book of the three we're working this part was published. Its name is Chubut, Brief History of an Argentine Province, and published by Virgilio Zampini. He was a renowned literature professor linked to cultural activities both in the Welsh community as in the provincial government, since he was the first Secretary of Culture of Chubut in 1958. This book was considerably shorter than Strasser's and perhaps therefore more capable of simplifying and canonizing the history of Chubut. In here, the Welsh colonization is presented as a crucial event. In fact, the chapter titled Towards the Definitive Settlement begins with their arrival. And the reasons for the immigration are explained, but basically because of the brevity of the book. However, the events are synthesized with no place for anecdotes. In that sense, the in-text coverage of the Welsh experience closely resembles that of the textbooks Chubut, My Province, and Noticia, which probably used this book as a basis, since they are from the same period. And the text itself is articulated by studying the presence of the state in Chubut as it establishes the crucial events that subsequently shaped the province. In this sense, this text manages to be instituted as the brief official history of the province and clearly shows the historical structure by which Chubut history has been thought, written, and taught until today. The last book we're covering today is History of Chubut, written by historian Clemente Dumbrau. It was published by the authorship of a renowned historian from Chile, and his book was launched as a part of a nationwide collection named History of Our Provinces. Since its introduction, the work proposes an academic understanding of history, quoting several renowned historians to establish his framework, his theoretical framework. It spans for almost 600 pages, covering from prehistory to present time, which was the early 80s, and is separated into 5 parts, mainly using the periodization used outlined by Zampini. The role of the Welsh settlement occupies 5 extensive chapters, which recount in detail the eve of the settlement enterprise, the settling process, and its establishment and consolidation. However, the Welsh experience is not read under the characteristics of a heroic feat, as in previous texts, although the adventurous nature of the enterprise is emphasized, and the Welsh are presented as pioneers of the settlement of white people in Chubut. After Dumbrau's book, no other work has intended to cover the entire provincial history. However, the importance of this work does not lie only in its academic quality, since new research has advanced considerably in some topics covered by the book. But its significance, however, lies in the fact that through this book, the teaching of provincial history in secondary school is structured. So, to summarize, Chubut historical literature has indeed helped consolidating the Welsh settlement as one of the cornerstones of province's history. Following a similar structure, they all agree on presenting the Welsh people as true pioneers in a land inhabited until that moment only by the native Patagonians, and as the group that helped the Argentine state to start taking possession of the Patagonian territory. However, educational literature operates differently. While the purpose of the former is to provide a narration of the history of a territory in order to create and articulate its past, the latter's purpose is much wider. The historical aspects are presented here to generate a sense of belonging and to build identity. After narrating Chubut's history, school textbooks intend to show how this past is part of their heritage, especially in the last book we saw, and how many of the practices and actions brought and done by the first inhabitants and the settlers are a central part of the province's culture. But it also surprises to see an oscillating importance given to the Welsh settlement's history. The early textbooks recognize it as one of the pillars of Chubut's history and past, but the ones published during the 1990s will only reduce it to its historical aspects as one topic among many. It was only in the 2000s that a much wider coverage was given, along with its recognition as an integral part of Chubut's heritage, of its Chubut cultural heritage, to be preserved not only by the Welsh community, but also by the provincial government. Thank you very much.